Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Expansion and Political Division, Part 2. We'll rejoin our story now of how the United States of America found itself tearing apart at the seams in the period known as the antebellum era. That is, the 30 years or so preceding the Civil War, wherein from the 1830s through the 1850s, the political strains over the nation's expansion and resulting division ultimately led toward a path of war. We saw last time that it was territorial expansion, principally beyond the Mississippi River, that saw these latent strains first manifest in the Missouri Compromise of 1819 and 20. These divisive sectional strains manifest themselves in the politics of the country as debates over expansion and territory brought to the surface competing visions of America's future. On the one hand, the push for territory received broad national support, and claims of manifest destiny and an empire of liberty celebrated the growing territorial boundaries of the United States. A journalist of the day, John L. O'Sullivan, writing of what he called America's manifest destiny, said the far-reaching, the boundless future will be the era of American greatness. In its magnificent domain of space and time, the nation of many nations is destined to manifest to mankind the excellence of divine principles, to establish on earth the noblest temple ever dedicated to the worship of the Most High, the sacred, and the true. Well, the purple prose of O'Sullivan there painting a kind of divine destiny for America's westward expansion, not unlike the painting from 1872 by the artist John Gast, which depicted America's westward expansion as an allegory of manifest destiny. Lady Liberty dominates the scene, looking angelic and diaphanous in her pale glow. Looking westward, she holds a book containing the Constitution of the United States, while in her left hand trails a telegraph wire. If you can look closely, you'll see that the wire then connects eastward along the path of the railroad toward the busy, developing far shore of America. The light guiding her westward now seems to frighten the inhabitants of the wilderness West. The West is depicted here as a wilderness of buffalo, of grizzly bear, and of Native American, all of whom seem to be running in fear of America's liberty, while patiently trotting the path westward are miners and farmers and stagecoaches and pioneer wagons, all of them harbingers of a greater liberty, a greater civilization, it seems, to come. And so the mythologized view of America's westward expansion, colored over with the purple prose of John L. O'Sullivan's Manifest Destiny article, gave to the American people a kind of generalized view of the country and its future, a dynamic, growing, territorial, expanding, almost imperialist view of the country's future. And to be honest with you, that's about the only general agreement I think the country was able to reach, because at the granular level, at the ground level of what expansion would mean materially, financially, whose interests would be better supported, those of slave owning, plantation owning, Southerners, or free farmers, that is, immigrants from the North, the homesteading, land plowing, free farmers. That question remained to be decided. And thus in the presidential election of 1848, as so often happens in America, these These tensions rise to the surface in the midst of a great election. And in the election of 1848, a new political party is organized representing a purely sectional interest, a northern interest known as the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party was the first viable political party with purely sectional support, a coalition of northern Whigs, Democrats, and anti-slavery types who sought to prohibit the spread of slavery into the western territories acquired. Their candidates did not win in the election of 48, but the question was whether or not the national political parties could hold out. For the time being, the political party system held the country's interests together. That is, enough northern and southern Whigs could vote along the party line, or enough northern and southern Democrats could vote along their party line to hold the political fabric of the country together. But the Free Soil Party, though it did not win the election of 48, earned about 10% of the popular vote by appealing strictly to northern voters. Without appealing to any southern voters, the Free Soil Party was able to earn 10% of the national vote. Now, both the Whig and Democratic candidates enjoyed both northern and southern support. Yet the Free Soil Party pulled votes away from the Democrats in certain key states, including New York, that allowed for a Whig victory. In other words, the Free Soil Party played a kind of spoiler's role. And though the major parties tried to avoid it, the slavery issue was still present, even as the Democratic candidate, Lewis Cass, advocated what he called a popular sovereignty approach to the questions of slavery's expansion. That is, the Democratic candidate Cass counseled that in the territories, inhabitants themselves, that is, residents of the territories, should be allowed to vote up or down on the slavery issue. The Whig Party candidate, Zachary Taylor, was himself a slave owner and a war hero in the recent Mexican War, and it was Taylor who won, running as a Whig, won the presidency in 1848 with no discernible stance to interfere or otherwise try to regulate slavery whatsoever. So, in many ways, the significance of the 48 election is that the Free Soil Party, the first purely sectional party, concentrating its support in the North as a visibly anti-slavery party, at least a party that resisted the expansion of slavery into the territories, was able to gain a viable minority share of the vote, drawing enough away from the Democratic Party to enable the Whigs to prevail. While the battle over the West and its territories was not yet over, the California Gold Rush in 1849 forced the issue back to the surface. The news spread like wildfire across the nation that gold had been discovered near Sutter's Mill in Northern California, just miles from our own hometown of Sacramento. It was a California newspaper at the time, an early newspaper called the Californian, that editorialized, "We believe slavery could not be generally introduced, that its recognition would blast the prospects of the country. It would make it disreputable for the white man to labor for his bread, and it would thus drive off to other homes the only class of immigrants California wishes to see, the sober and industrious middle class of society." Thus the Californian, a local newspaper in the new state of California, soon to be new state of California, still at that point a territory of the United States, editorialized that slavery should be kept out. Though acquired by the U.S. a year earlier, California's sudden wealth and growing population made it an excellent candidate for statehood. Yet the debate over slavery in California nearly derailed the writing of a state constitution. Southerners wanted to split the state at the 35th degree north parallel, and California's admission to the Union in 1850 forced yet another compromise. California's statehood threatened a political balance, and several more compromises were necessary to preserve the peace. And once again, it was Kentucky's own Henry Clay who had forged the so-called Missouri Compromise of 1819 and 1820. It was Henry Clay now, the great compromiser by reputation, who would forge a final political compromise before his death. The so-called Compromise of 1850 had been engineered initially by Henry Clay to maintain a semblance of peace within the two major parties. The terms of this compromise included California's admission as a free state, a bitter pill for Southerners perhaps, but leverage to gain their own concessions. No federal restriction of slavery in Utah and New Mexico, for example. Southerners won on that point by keeping the federal government, for the time being, out of the business of regulating slavery in the territories. Slavery would continue to exist in the nation's capital city, for example, but not the slave trade itself, a compromise measure which gave, perhaps a small victory to abolitionists who had long decried the presence of slavery and slave trading in the nation's capital as a mockery of America's proclaimed embrace of independence and liberty. Well, the abolitionists won a point, and that the slave trade would no longer be allowed to operate in the nation's capital, although slaves who then resided there could remain there under the aegis of their owners. Southerners also demanded a tougher, tightened fugitive slave law be passed by Congress, and so it was. The Congress will cede to Southerners' demands by passing a tougher fugitive slave law, one that built on the constitutional precedent for enjoining Northerners, that is, requiring Northerners now to give their full cooperation in the return of fugitive slaves who had run away and who had sought freedom across the Underground Railroad through northern states like Ohio, for example, which were well known as pathways to Canada and for fugitives on the run. Now the loophole in the laws would require Northerners to give their full and complete assistance to federal officials and slave catchers alike. So a variety of legal measures taken now in the Compromise of 1850. But once again, it really sort of brings the question to the forefront. What sort of compromise was this? Much like the Missouri Compromise in 1850, which saw Clay putting through pieces of legislation one at a time that one or the other section could agree to, and thus cobbling together a larger bill called a compromise, but which really didn't show much blended support between Northerners and Southerners, but rather found their respective positions voted on one at a time in a bundle, if you will, of legislation. The most controversial of these legislative pieces undoubtedly was this tougher fugitive slave law that I mentioned. A fugitive slave law which now inspired spirited emotions and calls for resistance throughout the North. Northerners who weren't even particularly sympathetic to abolitionism or anti-slavery generally could now find their voices merging with abolitionists because they resented what seemed to be, once again, the reach of the slave power into the North to require Northerners to be complicit, to participate in the business of returning slaves. For many Northerners who otherwise would not have cared much for abolitionism, this was a violation of their own civil rights. The law required all law enforcement agents in the North to cooperate with the apprehension of runaway slaves and provided harsh penalties for anyone found to assist runaway slaves. Typical of the Northern response was that issued by the Reverend Luther Lee of Syracuse, New York. "I would never obey it," said the Reverend. "I had assisted 30 slaves to escape to Canada during the last month. If the authorities wanted anything of me, my residence was at 39 Onondaga Street. I would admit that, and they could take me and lock me up in the penitentiary on the hill. But if they did such a foolish thing as that, I had friends enough on Onondaga County to level it to the ground before the next morning. So a note of defiance issued by the Reverend Minister Luther Lee of Syracuse, New York, one of a growing chorus of voices in the North pledging resistance to the fugitive slave law. It was the passing of the fugitive law that inspired the writing of a best-selling novel that depicted the horrors of slavery and the fugitive slave law itself. Authored by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote, "I would write something that would make this whole nation feel what is an accursed thing slavery is." And so her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was serialized in a northern newspaper, that is, its chapters appearing periodically over the course of a year, telling the story of a cast of characters, both slave and free alike, including the title character, the enslaved Uncle Tom, who endure the vicious hardships of slavery, all the while existing under the rubric of a Christian nation, something that Harriet Beecher Stowe hoped would excite the sentiments not only of Northerners but of Southerners who would see the basic immorality of slavery and how slavery had spread its toxic net over the entire country that ensnared a net that ensnared Southerners as well as Northerners. You can read the excerpts from Uncle Tom's Cabin, like the one here that tells of the slave woman Eliza's escape from the slave catcher across the frozen Ohio River, desperately racing to freedom with her child in her arms as the slave catcher's hounds were barking and nipping at her very heels. This is a harrowing drama that was meant to elicit, again, the sympathies of all who read it. Stowe's novel became one of the first bestsellers, you might say, in American history, selling well over 1 million copies and inspiring dramatic productions, stage productions. The poster you see here from an 1881 production, years after the Civil War, Uncle Tom's Cabin remained and retained its popularity. It is said that Abraham Lincoln, once President of the United States, would greet the author Stowe by claiming, "So you're the little lady that started this war." And as Lincoln's comment suggests, the novel was popular but also infamous among many white Southerners who saw in it again the desperate hand of the abolitionist North, which signaled to them an end time, you might say, approaching for the unions. Emotions ran high with yet another compromise, following on the heels of 1850 compromise, and once again the issue concerned the status of the Western territories. The so-called Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which attempted to settle the issue of slavery in the territories by reinforcing a line that ran across the United States, the so-called Missouri Compromise line, which was extended out from Missouri to the Pacific coast, which essentially had stated that no slavery would be allowed north of the line. Well, the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned that as Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas crafted his law in 1854, his bill in 1854, allowing territorial residents to decide for themselves whether to approve slavery, and thus overturning the decades-old Missouri Compromise line. This fell on the heels of Lewis Cass's position in 1848, you'll recall, to allow residents of the territories to decide for themselves, the so-called popular sovereignty solution to the slave question. Formalized in 1854 now as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Douglas hoped this would convince Southerners to allow, among other things, a proposed transcontinental railroad to pass through on a northern route, including his home state of Illinois. But Southerners were not happy with Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act. Enough of them voted for its passage into Congress, but even those who supported it were not entirely satisfied that their interests had been served, because after all, leaving it up to popular vote now meant that slavery could be voted down, and slaveholders had been invested in the argument for many decades that slaveholding was a constitutional right not subject to popular votes. And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act seemed to inspire distrust among Southerners, just as it infuriated Northerners now who were increasingly convinced of not only the slave power conspiracy, but a further conspiracy to engineer slaveholding in the Western territories. Many Northerners were outraged, in fact, by what they considered to be Stephen Douglas's betrayal. Here you see, in fact, a cartoon which shows slavery being forced down the throat of a northern free soiler as his head is held down by the political abettors of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Among those outraged, a group calling themselves the Independent Democrats, who in 1854 responded to the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska bill by issuing a statement in which they claimed that, and these were, by the way, mostly congressmen, northern congressmen now, in the vanguard of a new political movement. "We arraign this bill as a gross violation of a sacred pledge," they wrote, "as a criminal betrayal of precious rights, as part and parcel of an atrocious plot to exclude from a vast unoccupied region immigrants from the old world and free laborers from our own states, and convert it into a dreary region of despotism inhabited by masters and slaves." So the appeal of the Independent Democrats, giving voice now to this deepening belief that a conspiracy of slaveholding interests was attempting to force down the throats of Northerners the vile institution. And why vile? Because whether or not one saw it as a moral issue, many Northerners could agree that slavery would have the result of crowding out future free migration to the Western territories, denying Northerners their fair share of the spoils of territorial expansion. Among who felt this way was an Illinois lawyer who had served one term in Congress during the Mexican War and who had retired from politics after being defeated on his reelection attempt and had settled in to a profitable law practice instead. But upon passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Abraham Lincoln returned to the political fold, proclaiming, "We know the opening of new countries to slavery tends to keep the perpetuation of the institution, and so does keep men in slavery who otherwise would be free. This result we do not feel like favoring, and we are under no legal obligation to suppress our feelings in this respect." And so Lincoln re-enters politics now on behalf of a new political party that calls itself the Republican Party. And Lincoln, in effect, an early member of this movement, is a single-issue candidate. And the single issue being that of restricting the spread of slavery and keeping it from the Western territories. Here you see an early Republican cartoon showing Benjamin Franklin counseling Lady Liberty as she paddles the behind of Stephen Douglas, the architect of the 1854 Compromise. And a new political party, therefore, as I say, is born. A new political party dedicated to opposing the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Opponents labeled the Republican Party a party of fanatics and abolitionists, but its very existence pointed to the breakdown of true political unity across the sectional divide, because like the Free Soil Party, the Republican Party was an exclusively Northern party. Its first candidate for president was none other than the great Western explorer John C. Fremont. And it's here in this cartoon by the critics of the Republicans, that is, the Southern critics of the Republican Party who depict Fremont now here at the head of a rabble that is showing the new Republicans as being part of an unruly, rather motley assemblage of followers, including black people, fanatical abolitionists, old women, drunkards, rather too liberated feminists, you might say. Here this woman is shown smoking a cigar and wearing men's trousers. That is a kind of reform coalition of those whom Southerners saw as the lunatic fringe of the North. Worse than political party breakdown seen by the fracturing of the national parties was the violence it all unleashed in the territories of the West, particularly in Kansas. What came to be known as the Civil War in Kansas, or Bleeding Kansas, referred to a war between pro-slavery supporters and anti-slavery supporters for control of Kansas statehood. From 1854 to 1858, a guerrilla war, a violent and bloody guerrilla war, raged there and included the burning of Lawrence, the Free Soil capital of the state. 1,200 Northerners migrated to Kansas, many furnished with so-called Beecher's Bibles, which were actually Sharp's rifles named for the abolitionist minister Henry Ward Beecher, who, by the way, was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so looking at the territorial map now of Kansas, you see Southerners flooding into the southern regions, Northerners flooding into the northern and central and western regions of Kansas, all of them trying to gain a viable majority stake in the voting, which would decide whether Kansas be free soil or slave. And the ensuing conflict went far beyond politics, as I say, to actual civil war, a violent series of hit-and-run raids and attacks carried out by both northern and southern interests, including the burning of the so-called free soil capital of Lawrence. Violence was not contained within the territories, as it spilled over now even to the Congress itself. The famous incident involving the northern senator and sympathetic anti-slavery advocate Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who was attacked by a South Carolina congressman named Preston Brooks, who brutally assaulted Sumner in the Senate chamber, nearly killing him with repeated blows to the head, using his walking cane as a baton to batter the nearly defenseless Senator Sumner. And what had been Sumner's crime? He had given a speech in which he had ridiculed slave owners as pimps in a speech called The Crime Against Kansas. And taking offense and beholding and upholding Southern chivalry and honor, Preston Brooks attacked Sumner in full view of the Senate in a violent assault that was quickly reported. We might say these days it went viral. The story of Sumner's beating, the caning of Charles Sumner. It would take years for Sumner to recover his health, and many Southerners saw Preston Brooks as a hero for his manly response, as they saw it, to the libels of a Northerner and an abolitionist. But violence was returned as well, famously in 1858 now, in a raid on Harper's Ferry, a federal arsenal in what was still then the state of Virginia, now part of West Virginia. Harper's Ferry was a federal arsenal containing weapons and munitions that the abolitionist John Brown schemed to lay his hands on, that is, to requisition the contents of, for what he imagined would be now a war of liberation against the South, in which slaves would be liberated from the plantations by a raiding party of abolitionists captained by John Brown himself. Brown was an Ohioan who had recently been involved in the Civil War in Kansas, a steadfast abolitionist who believed that God had called him to the front ranks of abolition for the purpose of liberating the nation's slaves. Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was short-lived as a company of federal troops was dispensed upon news of the raid, ultimately pinning Brown and his men down inside the federal buildings where the arsenal was kept. He was wounded in the exchange of gunfire, imprisoned, and put on trial with the charge of treason. In his statement to the court, John Brown said, "I deny everything but what I have all along admitted, the design on my part to free the slaves. I intended certainly to have made a clean thing of that matter." Those in the North saw Brown as a kind of heroic figure, a martyr. "All true Christians," said this handbill, "who believe in immortality through Jesus Christ alone, are requested to pray for Captain John Brown, who is now under sentence of death and is to be hung next month for righteousness' sake." So Northerners, seeing Brown as a heroic figure, a martyr figure, a Christian martyr who was to give his life in a cause, a crusade, to allow slavery to be torn from the country, to purge this land, as he said, to purge this guilty land with blood if necessary, to eliminate the stain of slavery. Predictably, Southerners reacted in clearly opposite terms, with outrage to the news of Brown's raid. "Brown deserves to die 1,000 deaths upon the rack, to end in fire and termination in hell," said former President John Tyler. And after his conviction and his sentence of death for treason, Brown was led in a buckboard wagon with federal army escort. Remember, the arsenal at Harper's Ferry was a federal military arsenal, and thus his crime was a federal crime adjudicated in a federal court now and led by federal troops to the gallows. A contemporary observer of the event created this sketch showing the troops lined up and the hangman's scaffold with a body, that of John Brown, hanging by the neck. Jefferson Davis, soon to be president of the new Confederacy, was still a United States Senator at the time from Mississippi. And in a speech in December in '59, following Brown's execution, Davis said, "John Brown and 1,000 John Browns can invade us, and the government will not protect us. If we are not to be protected in our property and sovereignty, we are therefore released from our allegiance and will protect ourselves out of the Union. To secure our rights and protect our honor, we will dissever the ties that bind us together, even if it rushes us into a sea of blood." The more romantic, more sympathetic view of John Brown here, one of many such portraits drawn mostly after the fact, showing Brown as a dignified gentleman, really elderly in his dignified bearing here, being led by the military escort from the jailhouse, but not before he passes a presumably enslaved woman with her child, who look up with adoring eyes at the patriarchal figure of their hero, John Brown. So an emotional and dramatic episode was Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, one that elicited many different, wildly different viewpoints depending on one's geographical residency, north or south. The following year, of course, was an election year, and the 1860 presidential election proved now that the nation was no longer bound together by a central unifying ideal. The Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, garnered a purely sectional votes, entirely northern, along with Oregon and California. Lincoln's share, though not constituting an outright majority, only 39.8% of the vote, nevertheless garnered enough of a requisite electoral majority to tip the scales. And that was made possible because of the fracturing now of the political party system in the South as well. Keep in mind that Lincoln's name was not even on the ballot in any of the southern states. Clearly did Southerners believe that the Republicans were simply a party of abolitionism. Instead, the Democratic Party in the South, led now by its candidate John Breckinridge, was now forced to confront a fractured ticket as Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat, and John Bell, a member of a new third party in the South called the Constitutional Union Party, split the vote amongst themselves. No one of them garnering a majority to rival Lincoln's, and thus a split Southern vote, failing to match Lincoln's purely Northern and Western vote, saw the candidate of this new party, this Republican Party, which had only been formed on the heels of the Kansas-Nebraska Act 6 years earlier, a purely sectional party. And with Lincoln's victory, it seems the die was cast. As here we see from Charleston, South Carolina's Mercury newspaper, a full-page statement, if you will, the Union is dissolved. This was the statement now that met Lincoln's election night victory. The Union is dissolved. Of course, it hadn't been formally dissolved yet. This was a bit of hyperbole or propaganda on the part of the Charleston Mercury, which was a staunchly sectional, staunchly Southern, staunchly slave-holding newspaper that was proclaiming now the death of the United States. All that awaited was an ordeal by fire, which would come the following year, the instigation of the Great Civil War with the firing on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and an ordeal by fire, the nation's bloodiest, still to this day, bloodiest civil war. The Civil War will be now our next topic for consideration in the last remaining lecture of the semester to follow.